we don't expand our imagination,
justification for being what you are.
Welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm John Dickerson. White House officials spent the morning telling reporters that at noon, in the Rose Garden, the president would get angry about the oil spill in the Gulf. And indeed he did. Obama gave oil executives a stern talking to. He said their testimony before Congress this week, in which they attempted to blame each other, was a ridiculous spectacle. And he said he would not tolerate any more finger-pointing. Tough talk, but what does it mean? To discuss, I'm joined by Politico's Eamon Javers. Eamon, so what is the result of the president's tongue lashing today?
Yeah, well, there's not much. I mean, this is one of those situations which really shows kind of the limits of the presidency. I mean, here we have a situation that's about a mile underneath the Gulf waters at the bottom of the seafloor there. Barack Obama can't really control it directly, but what he's trying to do is send a very strong signal to BP that they better get their act together, and to American voters that he's going to expect BP to pick up the bar tab here for all this, which is going to be enormous.
Behind him, he had arrayed cabinet officials and a whole, host of people who are, the message here was, we are on the case. But what does it mean to be on the case? I mean, what exactly did he outline in terms of what's being done to try and deal with this?
Well, one of the things they're talking about is sort of a bureaucratic reshuffling, breaking up the different parts of the MMS, the federal agency which actually oversees these oil rigs and the drilling apparatus. They're going to break it into two separate groups, one that collects revenue, one that does safety and oversight. But that's sort of small beer relative to sort of the economic and environmental catastrophe that we're seeing on the Gulf Coast. So what the president's doing also by showing this sort of flash of anger today is showing Americans, particularly Americans who make their living on the Gulf Coast, that he gets it, that he said he's not going to rest until this problem is dealt with. But that could be a long time from now. What he really needs is Ed Harris from that movie Apollo 13, where he walked into the room with the box of duct tape and balls of wire and said, okay, guys, figure it out. And he got the best engineers in the room to try to save the spaceship. That's kind of where they're at right now with this project. They've got to get some engineers to come up with something inventive on the fly at the bottom of the seafloor.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, he talked today about the amount of boom that had been put into the water and the number of millions of gallons of oil water that had been picked up and all the rest, which was great in terms of the cleaning up. But why? What's your guess on why there hasn't been that Ed Harris moment? Why hasn't the president said, we're going to convene an emergency meeting of anybody who has a decent notion about how to do this, and we're going to try and do something to deal with the actual leak ongoing now for 25 days.
Well, they have said that they're going to bring some of the best government scientists involved and some other scientists from the worlds of academia and other places to try to come up with some kind of out-of-the-box solutions, because all the sort of regular oil company kinds of things that you would do to fix this have really been tried at this point. And you can't keep going having an Exxon Valdez-size oil spill every 4 days, which is what one estimate says this is, without really trying to do some things that maybe have never been tried before. But it's really a tough spot for the president. I mean, he really sees the position he's in politically, where he's trying to control a situation that's largely uncontrollable by him.
He did also today say that the government had fallen short too, didn't he?
Yeah. He did, and he knows that he's on the hook and his administration is on the hook. These are his guys. They work inside his executive branch, and if they bungle it, he will take the political heat for it.
Finally, on the hearings this week were part of the kind of long narrative that's going to go on, separate and apart from the cleanup and the recovery and the limiting of the oil here. Right. What's your sense of how long that goes on, the different ways it plays out in terms of, just as this story goes on in its sort of governmental capacity, separate and apart from the oil spill?
Well, I think a lot of what was going on in that hearing was the oil executives were playing not just to the audience of members of Congress who were there and not just to the TV viewing public. They're also playing to a third audience, which is maybe more dangerous to them, which is the army of trial lawyers who are mobilizing to sue the pants off of everybody who was involved in this thing at every step of the way. What they're really trying to duck here is not just the blame, but the massive, massive amount of liability that's going to result from this thing. I guarantee you this will be in the courts for decades as people sue each other and try to get damages out of this thing. Entire industries are being affected by this. The scale in terms of dollars is going to be enormous, much bigger than what we saw with the Exxon Valdez. So what they're dealing with here is the specter of just an enormous amount of liability and lawyers really circling, trying to get a piece of it.
And no sign of this oil stop stopping anytime soon. Okay.
And that's a tragedy.
Eamon Javers, thanks very much from Politico for
Thank
joining
you.
us. Now on to this week's Flashpoints with CBS News national security analyst Juan Zarate, who takes us around the globe highlighting those important stories we might miss. One story we couldn't have missed was Karzai's visit to Washington. Let's talk about that first.
That's right, John. This was a face-saving, fence-mending trip to soothe the phrase in the relationship between Washington and Kabul. I think they did that. I think it was very important. The administration rolled out the red carpet for Karzai and a number of his ministers. He spent time with President Obama, dinner with Vice President Biden, several meetings with Secretary Clinton, walks to talk about the diplomatic engagement. But importantly, there was substance at play here. From the U.S. perspective, obviously dealing with good governance and corruption, talking about those things quietly, talking about Kandahar, pushing back on the Taliban's influence in Kandahar and the operations that are likely to come this summer, as well as talking about reconciliation. How do you deal with this very difficult issue of trying to politically reconcile? And so from a U.S. perspective, there was a lot of substance to get to, but the first part was to make sure that the relationship actually is not fraying and is strong for the future.
Now, why is that important? Because there was a period where administration officials on the record and particularly off the record were beating up on President Karzai. Why does that have to be fixed?
Well, the beating up happened perhaps a little too much. There was a lot of it being done by different parts of the government. It was being done publicly in ways that I think at the end of the day started to hurt Karzai's credibility, his own sense of what the friendship was about. We saw the effects of it. He even gave the hyperbolic statement of perhaps wanting to join the Taliban in response to this. A little bit ridiculous and a little bit of a fringe statement, but it did reflect, I think, some tension that was starting to emerge because of the deep and public criticism. Part of this is personal, too. There's been a lot of criticism of Karzai's brother, his role in Kandahar, whether or not he's a corrupt official, and that goes to the heart of some of the concerns that the Obama administration has had.
Okay, so now from a very new ally and perhaps shaky ally to our oldest ally, let's talk about the new prime minister in Great Britain.
Well, you have odd bedfellows in this coalition government, with the conservatives, which have traditionally been U.S. allies, very much westward focused in terms of their transatlantic relationship, matching up with the liberal Democrats, led by Nick Clegg, who during the campaign said openly that he did not think there was a special relationship with the U.S., which is a buzzword in diplomatic circles, is the sort of the bedrock of the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. And so one question has been, what does the foreign policy amidst this coalition, this odd coalition, look like? I think for the most part we're going to see stability in that foreign relationship, in part because you obviously have the Prime Minister who is from the Conservative Party, the Defense Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. All the key foreign policy makers are from the Conservative Party.
And stability means what with respect to what hot-button issues? Iran, the war against global terror in Afghanistan. Where will it be sort of most important to have stability with Great Britain?
I think the three hot-button issues are Afghanistan and the status with NATO and whether or not we're successful, we stay the course there. Iran, what happens ultimately with Iran? Can we get not only the UK but the rest of the international community on board with tough sanctions and perhaps even more if need be in the future? And then finally, the general status of relations in Europe with all of the crisis going on in Europe, whether or not the UK will be a stalwart part of not just a European order but also a relationship with the US that makes a difference to our interests.
Okay, and this third topic, let's move to the shooting of this Thai general.
This was a general known as Commander Red. He was a renegade general who was helping the protesters who've now been protesting for over a month in the heart of Bangkok. They've actually set up different encampments in parts of Bangkok, and this has been going on. It's something that's been festering. We've been watching it. It's been on the cutting list in terms of the flashpoints topics. But importantly, there have been the potential breakthroughs for a negotiated settlement. The current Prime Minister had offered some elections which seemed to placate the demonstrators, but then the demonstrators pulled back. What this assassination does, though, and it was an assassination attempt or a shooting during an interview with a New York Times reporter, quite dramatic. What it does is it fuels the demonstrations again. You have now more people joining the demonstrations, more tension with the government as to what happens next. and there isn't really a safe way out of this problem. I think you're going to see further tensions, and you saw it overnight, more tensions on the streets of Bangkok.
And obviously this isn't good for Bangkok, but how does it have, what's its more global implications of unrest there?
Well, Thailand and Bangkok have always been seen as stable parts of a Southeast Asian order in some ways. And, you know, the demonstrations haven't spilled out in such a way that it's created a sense of regional instability. But I think people in the region, in particular the economic watchers, are watching very carefully how this is impacting Thailand's long-term reputation as a place for stable investment and stability. You know, a lot of the five-star hotels that are affected by this have been shutting down. A lot of foreign visitors have been leaving. And so for Thailand itself and for the economic development in the region, and Bangkok's often been a gateway to other countries like Vietnam, etc., it could have a longer lasting impact, but we'll see.
Okay, last topic then is Al-Qaeda in Iran.
AP reported this week that Iran is easing its grip on Al-Qaeda leadership in Iran. Folks often forget that core portion of the Shura Council, the senior leadership from Al-Qaeda core, actually is in Iran and has been in Iranian custody since 2003. Folks like Saif al-Adil, Abu Ghaith, the spokesman, al-Mauritani, the spiritual advisor to bin Laden, all have been in Iran. And an interesting question folks like I had to worry about when we're in the administration, and folks that are watching this carefully have to worry about, is what is the relationship between Al-Qaeda and Iran? Fundamentally, they don't like each other. They are the extremes on the Sunni side from the Al-Qaeda types and extremes on the Shia side, and they don't like each other. But there have been often questions as to whether or not they're making deals with each other in opposition to the great Satan, the far enemy, as they often call the United States.
And how much is there then a connection between the far enemy, which is trying to impose tougher sanctions on Iran, and this loosening, even given the fact that they're historical enemies? But is there any relationship between increased U.S. sanctions and this loosening on Al-Qaeda?
Well, there may be, because Iran is trying to read the tea leaves. They're trying to figure out, is there potential military action coming? What are the tools that Iran has to stave that off, or even to deter it? And so folks have often argued, and I've often said that Iran would use these senior leaders as chips with the United States, potentially chips with Al-Qaeda as they deal with Al-Qaeda attacks against Shia around the world, including in Iraq.
Right.
And so it's a complicated relationship, and no doubt Al-Qaeda leadership, which is now reeling from being decimated in Pakistan, and would be very happy to have some of these key leaders back, and Iran trying to read the tea leaves of international pressure. They are no doubt triangulating here, and so this report is an interesting one because it gets at that relationship, and it's one that's very murky and hard for the United States to read.
That's fantastic, Juan Zarate. Thanks very much,
Thank
as
you,
always.
John.
And finally, music and fashion mogul Russell Simmons was in Washington this week meeting with young entrepreneurs. We caught up with Simmons earlier and got his take on how young people can achieve their own success. Take a look.
Appreciate it. Okay, a couple quick questions. You're a really busy guy. Why devote time to Summit Series?
Because I think that the young entrepreneurs here have the power to change the world. And if I can, just get one person to be a greater giver, then I've given a lot, because they're so influential and so powerful, the people here. And if I can get them to ease up just a bit, when I was their age, all I wanted to do is get ahead. And then I get a little older and I realize you can't really get ahead. That giving is the basis of you getting in the first place. And so if I can make them ease up just a bit, they'll be so much more successful and do so much more good for the world. So that's a good reason to be here.
When you were just starting out, did you ever imagine that one day you would be a role model for young entrepreneurs?
No, I didn't imagine that I might be a role model. But, it's a responsibility that I personally take. I don't think anybody owes anybody anything, but I just it helps me sleep if I can inspire people to be greater givers or do more good, or help more people. So as a role model, if that's what I am, then I want to influence people to be better for humanity, to do more for the environment, to protect the animals, to fight for the rights of others the way they would like people to fight for their own rights. So all the foundations that I'm involved in and all the work that I support that other people are doing on those subjects. If I can get other entrepreneurs to be the same or to help them with their quest, and that's good.
You champion a lot of causes. What do you want to see Washington get done right now?
I think that the president has doing a lot of the good that he talked about. He's doing the prison reform. He's doing the drug policy reform. He's doing the gay rights work that he promised. He's doing his work to end the war in Iraq, or end our involvement and trying to give them a way to survive. He's cautious about the way he's dealing with the rest of the world, and he's not. He's reaching out to the Muslim community in a way that makes sense, not promoting more negativity, but trying to reach out and let the Muslim community know around the world that we respect them. Or in the past, we have not respected them. His speech in Cairo, something people forgot or didn't even realize didn't give anything up but love. He just came and spoke and didn't change anything. He didn't make a policy change. He just said to the Muslim community, we respect you. And that's something that America has not done. So I think he's doing a lot of what he promised. His choices for the Supreme Court. People are so angry because he's doing all the things he said. Same way some progressive people didn't like some of the choices that President Bush made. He was very thorough. He did his job. Now it's Obama's turn. He's thorough and doing his job, and I think it's great.
Mm-hmm. Last question. You're here in Washington. You certainly know how to draw a big crowd. Any chance you could run for office one day? No, I got too many. Someone said if you were to really tell America to stop eating hamburgers, that you would lose all the midterm elections. They said because the lobbyists, if you were to tell, oh my God, I have so many ideas about government that are so different from what the mainstream is, and so at odds with the businesses that support our politicians, that I couldn't raise any money. I'm sure of it. So. I'm sorry that there's so much undue influence by lobbyists. I'm sorry we spend so much on military and so little on education. I'm sorry the way we abuse the planet and each other and the animals. I'm sorry about, but I don't think as a politician I'd be able to get a lot of support. But I can support those who are making certain changes, and I can have a voice that's uninhibited, and I like that. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
An uninhibited voice is rare in Washington. Catch Washington Unplugged next week, and R. Kayleigh Hartung with a profile of the 7 founders of the DC 10 Summit. That's it for Washington Unplugged on CBSNews.com. I'm John Dickerson. Have a great weekend.